Hi everyone, welcome to Bab Nines. So the news came out yesterday that West Ham are looking for a director of football in the summer. So regardless of what happens from a managing perspective, there's clearly going to be a summer of change at West Ham. Could this be a good thing? Could this be a bad thing? We know previously when we did the director of football route, didn't go so well. He was sacked with the manager. But maybe we've learned the lessons from the previous time. We'll go into the kind of news and we'll give our view as to whether we think this is a good or a bad thing and what this could also mean for the club. As we say, guys, there's news being reported by Sean Whetstone of at West Ham Football. Obviously, he has very good ties with the club and gets regular news around what's happening. Obviously, this was released as of yesterday, stating obviously we're looking to appoint a director of football this summer as West Ham board regain full control over transfers. Director of football report to board and not manager. Where this leaves David Moyes and Rob Newman remains to be seen. The director of football does not affect Mark Noble's role as sporting director. So obviously there are initial alarm bells. The fact that the board are going to be back in control, as that says, of transfers does obviously make people nervous because by association, when they hear the board is in control, they then review Davy Sullivan's in control. And that means going back to the old school days of just working with trusted agents. Now, I completely agree. I understand that. And I also do have reservations if it's just so that he can be a de facto director of football, take that control and essentially have, in many ways, a patsy sitting in the director of football role. Now, to caveat, to give the counter argument to that, is a director of football is essentially part of the board. He is part of that control network. So you have the board at the top. Underneath that, you have sporting directors, director of football, technical directors, and so on. They are essentially responsible for running the club, and then they report up to the board, who are in fact obviously the owners, chairmen, arguably the bank, the financiers of the club. Now, if West Ham have learned their lessons from the past, they're going to be looking to employ a director of football who is going to essentially start to work as to be part of that board network, that executive level, and that will not move, will not change, regardless of manager and so on. So essentially, they become a permanent feature in the club. Now, we also have Mark Noble already instilled as a sporting director. So obviously, the question is, if his role's not changing, then what is his role if he's now not director of football? I would assume that means that from a transfer perspective, a scouting perspective, he will have limited involvement. His involvement as a sporting director will be around setting the philosophy of the club. So essentially, how do we move forward in the short to medium term? What are our short to medium term plans in terms of how do we want to be as a club with our youth academy and so on? How do we want to help to develop those? How do we want to create those pathways from the youth system up into obviously the main team? He would also be about that culture of the club. How does he want the culture of the club to be, the philosophy? What kind of a playing style, what team do we want to kind of be? And working in line with the director of football, they will then start to then structure as to creating those logical pathways for the youth players, for instance, from like the under 18, under 21 level into the first team, obviously utilising that kind of pathways in which to then identify where in the first team they could have an opportunity. Not only that then means that then they can be more targeted in other areas in terms of transfers and so on. Also, from a director of football point of view, I think they're going to be involved in more the analytics, the scouting, and the recruitment. I believe that's what it's going to be. Probably in line with Mark Noble, they will then have conversations as to shortlisting potential managers based on the ideals maybe of the board as to what they kind of want or what their vision is for the club in terms of playing style and so on, and what they want to see on the pitch. both Mark Noble and the director of football then will be in charge in which to creating that environment where we can play that type of football by finding the right managers, by finding the right players, finding the right youth players and bringing them through. I think that's ultimately what the plan is. So I do have massive reservations because obviously it is the board looking to take control. But as we've seen with David Moyes, he can get fixated on players. We wasted a long time on Brozier. We wasted so much time up to the point where he got injured. Terra Moffi, again, another player that we were looking at. It was a player that was potentially identified by Mark Noble, someone that we should be looking for. We didn't move quick enough. There was a hesitancy in which to pay for him to come. Obviously, there was a hesitancy for the player want to stay in France. But again, that lack of movement. We could have had Terra Moffi the year before. He was available for a lot less money, but David Moyes chose not to. Instead, we went for Darwin Núñez, but we went for him much later in the window, and so on. So it's that slow, pensive movement, wanting to see what happens with Moyes is what has essentially hindered us in the market when we could have maybe had one or two extra players and possibly even got ourselves a Europa League final by getting one of those two players that he took his time to make a decision because he wanted to see how his team was doing over that January rather than being reactive and getting players in to give that final push. Now, obviously, in the summer, we did spend a lot of time wasting on players, you could argue. Obviously, there is prioritization, so he's gone for priorities first to ensure that he doesn't spend the money that he would need for the priority player. But again, we're too reactive. And from a scouting perspective, again, we don't necessarily move forward as quickly as we should do. Now, what I would say, and in fairness to Rob Newman, is the caliber of players that have come in, the caliber of players that we have scouted in the last 18 months since he's been there has been of an improvement. There has been a lot of links to kind of unknown players or players from unfavoured leagues. But again, I don't think we have a manager who is comfortable with that approach. We see look how long it's taken him to bed in Paqueta. Most of that has come around not knowing the player itself. Danny Ings, I know it's being pushed by others that was a gift not a Moyes choice. I don't believe it wasn't a Moyes choice. I do believe it was a gift, but a gift in the sense of we're going to give you this player because you want him. We want to show that we're backing you. So once again, it's we've kind of moved forward. Now, I don't personally think Moyes will stay if he's not given that control. He's not the type of manager who does well with just being given players, asked to coach them and bring them and embed them in. If we've seen anything we judge anything by this year and how long it's taken him to embed certain players, he's not that type of manager to bring those in. So a director of football could be very good for West Ham if we make the right appointments. And by right appointments, I mean you have to look at people of the caliber of, I'm not saying that we should go for them or we will go for them, but the caliber of the likes of, say, Paul Mitchell, the caliber of Michael Edwards. So Michael Edwards was at Liverpool for many a year. So the start of that Klopp era, he and his team identified and brought in Klopp. They also then went on that hugely successful transfer period where bringing in the likes of Mo Salah, bringing in Sadio Mane. Again, obviously, we didn't have, he wasn't involved with Jordan Henderson, but again, the other players like Fabinho, Van Dijk, so on. Yes, there are big money transfers in there as well, but they were responsible for that really successful period in the transfer market, which also then transpired in Liverpool going into the realms in which they did, which, without Man City, they would have been dominating the English Football League as well as Europe. For those who don't know Paul Mitchell was instrumental in Red Bull in their kind of model, working within that structure, and then moved over to Monaco. For those who don't know, just a prime example of the type of kind of things that he can do. I believe he was there at the time with Tuchemeni, part of the team that actually brought him in. They brought him in for 16 million, sold him for almost 100 million to Real Madrid 18 months later. He's that kind of guy that will have a team that sets up to identify those players that are on the cusp of being a real quality player, picking them up when they're young, and then obviously selling them on for big money. And that's something as a club we shouldn't be afraid of. We shouldn't be concerned about being a stepping stone. I think a director of football, they tend to understand that and actually look for that. It's finding that next young talent or the next young talents embedded within experienced collective, and then selling that talent on to get the next young talent who is a tier above them when they brought them, and so on. And then you start to then gradually improve as a team, and also you can also then go out and spend and buy bigger, more established players, or those not just emerging names, but those known names that are still young and looking to be on the cusp of going into those bigger teams. So a director of football could be fantastic for West Ham. It's something we've needed for a while. We need that professional structure that allows us to operate past the manager. Obviously, the manager needs to have that point of a manager works for them. In a sense, they are obviously reporting up to director of football up to the board. So to have those clear lines of authority, but not only that, it's those people who can make quicker decisions, who have the power to make those decisions and power to enact changes much quicker and more appropriately. Also, it does mean that a manager will have an influence, but not necessarily the deciding factor. Now, while most people say, oh, that's a bad thing, we'll look at Pep Guardiola. Pep Guardiola is a prime example of someone who doesn't necessarily target players or not necessarily interested in scouting players or being part of that process. He will have a say if there's one or two players that he does like, but ultimately he will turn around and say, I need this type of profile in this position for this player. And then that's on to his scouting team to go and find that player. He will then coach that player into his system. Obviously, he will sign them off, but ultimately he's not as invested in those initial and early stages. It's about getting that short list to him and then him reviewing and going, let's move forward and so on. So having that kind of process allows the manager to concentrate more on the playing side. Director of football can obviously be highly involved in that side as well to help manage those things such as player contracts as well. So a prime example, Souček's contract was apparently rejected by David Moyes because he didn't think he was worth that the money. Yet he's played him all season. He now goes into next year with, I think, only a year left on his contract. So again, taking those decisions out of the hands of the manager and then making a football decision based on what the club requires or needs is a much smarter process. So to remove that from the manager, yes, you remove their level of autonomy, but ultimately that's the direction football's been going in for years. So we arguably need a coach as well as a manager, someone who can manage that team, create that good ethos within that team, but someone who can also get players that maybe they don't necessarily know very well or would have picked themselves, but based on what it says requirements, this is a player that we found because it fits our needs and so on, and then can coach them. So it could be a really interesting process. If it's all aligned, then obviously it can be a great kind of vehicle to drive the club forward. Just got to look at the way Brighton have moved forward in recent years. Obviously, Liverpool have moved forward. The likes of Red Bull and even Monaco, if we're looking outside of the Premier League, have done incredibly well. Man City have a phenomenal record in the transfer market. Yes, they have the money to spend, but also they identify brilliant players and they get them in at good money. And that's the point. We need to have a very well versed and experienced director of football to help us navigate through what is ultimately always a very difficult time for a club, which is that window. Ideally, we'll get someone in who is also going to be involved in, if we are going to move away from David Moyes, who absolutely is involved in that decision-making process of bringing in a new manager. Rob Newman, personally, I would keep. I would keep him as the head of scouting, maybe the head of recruitment, but he reports directly up to the director of football. So he is part of that process. He has a team that he works with, but he's not at that executive level. And just as a kind of manager, obviously, director of football would need to come in and really invest and improve the statistical analysis within a West Ham to improve the scouting network and the scouts that we have, and to start to set some really clear boundaries. And obviously with Mark Noble, start to ensure that we have a manager that essentially is part of that West Ham identity of the Academy of Football, the club that promotes their own, who looks to have that really hard-working ideal, but play a good attacking football. That is the old school West Ham mentality. It's really hard-working, likes to play front foot football, likes to then develop its own and bring through its own. That has been missing for a number of years. Whilst Moyes has been very successful for us in this period, he doesn't fit that West Ham model, because despite the number of youth players that have been given debuts, the number of under-23s that have played this season, or even the minutes, is less than, I think, 200, maybe 300 minutes for under-23s this year. And the only reason it would be higher would be because of Ben Johnson, because he's still only 22. But other than that, there are no others really getting a chance to show what they can do. Whereas when you look at from the other end of the scale, from the plus 30s, there's an incredible number of minutes in those players, and less in the youth players. It's not really been at development. We're also incredibly pragmatic. We don't really attack. Yes, we are hardworking at times, but we're not really not really a team that reflects the old school identity that West Ham was built on, and kind of was perpetuated by the likes of Lyle and Greenwood, by developing your own through hard work, through grit and determination, and playing some attractive football. That has been lost in recent years. So maybe going down this route of a director of football who's going to look for those progressive types of managers, those players that are comfortable. Essentially, the way Barcelona was once described, they are artisans, but they are also craftsmen, and so essentially, they're very creative, they're very artistic, and yet they know how to grind, and they have the grit and determination. They're the types of profiles you need to have. And having a director of football, it means that we have someone who, outside of the coaching side, can work all year round in which to create relationships with agencies, create relationships with players, have those conversations away from the football pitch, and allow the manager just to concentrate on the team, remove that burden of having to be involved in every facet of the game. Football is so big now that having a manager involved in every single aspect of the club just isn't the best way to operate. And I think that's what we've seen. It's now come to a head. Moyes has done a brilliant job for us in this period, but this season, I think we've seen essentially that totalitarian kind of need or want to have so much control in football for him has caused issues within the club, for us in terms of the transfer market, in terms of scouting, in terms of the management of players, identifying the right players and then embedding them. And then obviously looking into future windows, the time needed in which to be across every area of West Ham is too much. And I think that's one of the reasons we have essentially failed this year. We could, if we win the Europa Conference, then obviously he can go off into the sunset very happily with his reputation still intact. But I do feel that this move in itself is part of a process in which we move away from David Moyes. I don't see him accepting a final year under those kind of limitations and restrictions, and potentially having to play players that he does not agree with, he does not want, that has not scouted or is comfortable with. And if they are brought in, then it's probably going to take a while for him to get that level of trust to play them. And if we're going down this route direct for football, then that's not going to be a conducive working environment for any, because there's going to be consistent friction as to why is this player not playing. We brought this player in to be part of the 11 and he's not playing. So I do think that whilst Moyes may try to keep his job by saying, well, I would work under these conditions and so on, I think we've seen enough to suggest that that's not necessarily the case. But yeah, it's a tricky one. This could be a fantastic piece for West Ham because it finally sets a level of professionalism and separation that we've needed for a long time, and means that we have a director of football who can be involved past, say, any manager who is involved in those decisions. Obviously, if they do a poor job themselves in terms of the transfers and which managers they bring in, then yes, their job will be at risk. But ultimately, this is an appointment that points to a longer term solution and plan in which to create much greater football knowledge within the club at an executive level, in which to manage those day-to-day operations and to remove some of those burdens from the manager. And that in itself, as much as I do not like our board, does have to be praised, especially if the idea is to give them a level of autonomy to work within the framework that they have set, within the finances that they have approved. Then I'm all for it. If it is just for David Sullivan can have control and have a patsy, then it's obviously a terrible idea, and that needs to not happen. But again, playing devil's advocate, this could simply be because this whole process is because David Krasinski is looking to take a majority control in the summer. He's asking David Sullivan to clear house, to remove the likes of Moyes, to remove Newman. He wants essentially remnants of the last board, the last kind of control to be removed. So he has a clean slate when he comes in to go and appoint a director of football to work alongside Mark Noble for that little level of continuity, to then go and bring in his own manager, his own director of football, which that he can then work with and trust to then take the club forward. But if you like this video, guys, please do like, please do subscribe. And as ever, as we always say at the end of every video, come on, you Irons.